Hey everyone, this is a quick video about synthesis. And if you've never heard of synthesizing before, this is a way to help you think about your sources in a different way that moves beyond just dropping in quotations that you think support your main point. It's a way of integrating multiple sources together in a way that improves your tone, improves your structure, and makes your project even more well-developed. Synthesis is essentially about placing sources in conversation with one another. And not only placing your sources in conversation with one another, but also placing them in conversation with your voice and the argument that you're making. You might hear me refer frequently to sources talking to each other. This might seem strange, but it's really about sources speaking to the same topics. Are they referring to the same things? Are they talking about the same issues? Are they thinking about problems in similar or divergent ways? How do they agree or disagree? This is at the most basic what I'm talking about when I'm talking about synthesis. Where do your sources seem to debate each other? What are ways in which they overlap or contrast? So you might think about your sources as a Venn diagram where there are places of agreement and disagreement. You might think of it as a debate. So if it helps you to picture your writers of your sources on a debate stage arguing with one another, do that. Synthesis is all about giving those sources the space in your project to have that conversation and to either agree or disagree. Remember that in Stedman's article about annoying ways people use sources, he explains that sometimes readers think, quote, all writers know that outside sources should be introduced, punctuated, and cited according to a set of standards. As we know, this isn't always the case. Outside sources aren't always integrated in ways that are effective. So synthesis is about finding an effective way to integrate those sources that not only values the source material, but also values the larger conversation that those sources are having with one another. I like to think about synthesis as photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, as we know, is a way to grow plants. Maybe if you were in school and your elementary school was similar to mine, you did an experiment about growing soybeans. You might have gotten a little soybean and a little cup with soil to plant it in. And you filled up your cup with soil and you put in your soybean and you watered it and placed it on a windowsill. And you watched over a couple of days or weeks as your little soybean seed sprouted and started to grow an actual plant. Synthesis, like photosynthesis, is all about pulling in different aspects to create something new. Photosynthesis, in that process, we're pulling in soil and a seed and water and sunlight to grow a plant. None of those things seem related to one another at the outset, but when they come together, they create something new. Your sources operate the same way. They each might be talking about different topics in different methods, using different tools, but when you pull them together, you create something new, the argument that you're making. So yes, I'm thinking about all of your projects as little soybeans that are growing thoughtfully in your brains and are just waiting to be sprouted. When we're talking about synthesis, an important way to integrate synthesis into your project can start very simply. It can start with signals of synthesis. So using these signal phrases will help you remind yourself that you need to not only be dropping in quotations, but you also need to be integrating those quotations in a way that they speak to one another. So signal phrases are ways to allow those sources to speak to one another and help you inform your understanding of the topic as well. So depending on what phrase you're using, and I'll give you some examples, you can use signals at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle to connect two or more sources. And these phrases can be really helpful to use, especially if you're struggling with what synthesis is or aren't really sure where to begin. This is a great place to start. Remember that at its most basic, synthesis is articulating agreement or disagreement. So words like additionally, like, also, as well, comparably, correspondingly, in a similar way, all of those can convey agreement between two sources. And you'll notice that I've tried to use capitalization for words that might work at the beginning of a sentence and lowercase for words that you might be using in the middle of a sentence instead. Disagreement can be conveyed through words like alternatively, but, contrarily, contrasting, conversely, and however. There are many more words that you can use to signal that you're synthesizing sources, but this is a great place to start if you're struggling or you just want some words that you can plug into the formula of synthesis to make those sources work with one another. As you're writing and you're thinking about synthesis, it can be helpful to consider what questions you have as a result of your research. So what things are brought up for you as you're reading your source material? Are there questions that arise from certain articles that other articles seem to respond to? What conclusions can you draw based on your source material? Are there results that seem to be based upon the majority of research? You might find that from trends or points of agreement that occur in your research. Are there things that it seems like every writer seems to agree on? Are there things that the majority of writers seem to agree on? Are there points of disagreement, points of contention, or places where there are unsettled ground? And if you had to summarize your research findings, how would you do so simply? Think of this as trying to explain your project or your research in an elevator talk. If you only had the length of time from when you stepped onto an elevator to when you stepped off of it to explain what your project was about, how would you do that? Could you do it simply, or is it too complex for that? How would you summarize the research that you've read so far? Remember that synthesis is mainly about comparing your source material and putting it together to create something new. You're using various sources and integrating them in conversation with one another to further your conversation, to further your argument that you're making with the source material.